We interrupt this program to bring you an important update. Strange shenanigans involving the spirits of the dead in Wales? We're not surprised. And we have reports of sightings of a tiger, although it might actually be a lady. Let's go over to our correspondents, Booth and Amelia Gorman, for details.
Runa lifts her veil. The sun has poured itself out across the horizon. When the last of the gold drips away, Runa squeaks open the lich gate and steps inside. Across the threshold into the yard, as the light turns down all around, her footsteps are needle soft on moth's paths.
Imagine a stroll past a picket fence or a slideshow. An image starts, stops, starts again. It's always a little different than the one before it, always changing in some way. Colors blur like the surface of a Secchi disc or a sprinting tiger.
I have a list of things that I really loved about it, and what does it mean?
Yeah. So like clearly my piece as a whole is riffing on the Stockton, I've heard it called a fairy tale, The Lady and the Tiger. And that story is like just fascinated me for a long time. This sort of concept of like it's a riddle. It's a several thousand word riddle in the form of a short story, basically. And kind of unpacking that and like, the sort of the original story asks the question of like, who does this man end up with, the lady or the tiger? And it's like, well, what if there's even more than that? And so it's also essentially a list story answering the question of like, what else could the answer be? What about you? What was your kind of inspiration? Or
my partner at the moment is writing a book about the Snows Hill collection, which is a collection of magical objects at the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle. And one of these objects is called the Wondrous Candle. And while we were there at the museum in the library doing research, we found one of the original display cards for the Wondrous Candle, and it said it was a spirit trap. Now, it wasn't actually a spirit trap. It was actually a theatrical prop made by a guy who owns Snows Hill that my partner's writing the book about. The spirit trap was supposed to be put in a graveyard with a candle lit behind it to attract moths, and moths were said to be the souls of the dead. And so the practitioner could then talk to the souls of the dead and pass messages beyond the veil. So that's what kind of inspired me about it.
Cool. Yeah. I love like a good fantasy horror. And one thing I even kind of thought when I first read it was like, is this a sort of secondary world story? Like, is this supposed to take place in the real world? Because it could just as easily exist in a fantasy world. And I was wondering if you intended it that way at all, or
it was intended to be quite set in the real world. I mean, but it's open to however you interpret it. With yours as well, you're basically saying it like this is not a metaphor. But is it a metaphor? Is there
metaphor? I think I like things that don't necessarily easily unpack themselves. So I try to write with that sense of ambiguity. Another thing I wrote down about yours is that your descriptions of like the yew tree in it are so visceral, and I wonder if you do you go to nature a lot for inspiration? And
I do. I write a lot of folk horror. All of my writing, I've been actually criticised for writing too much nature stuff. But it's
man, I hate that. People think it's like, I don't know, tacky or outdated, but I mean it's such a huge part of people's lives nowadays is still so rooted in like a love of nature that write more about it, please.
And that as well, in that story, the pulpit yew is a real place, like by me that I've visited. So I just go to places and describe them. I don't make anything up. I'm quite lazy. Whereas yours was like very I was wondering, because I also write quite a lot inspired by dreams that I've had. And when I was reading yours, it read so much like it had that kind of like dream logic and dream transitions. I was wondering if it was like, oh, did you write this? Like, did you write this from a dream or anything? But obviously, you've explained more.
Not from what I really had, but I'm very glad you said that, because I feel like mine works. I see it as like, if I had to describe it, I would call it more of like a nightmare than a story. Like,
Well,
it, you know, my piece doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have named characters. And the setting sort of changes as I need it to. So I was, you know, hopefully leaning into a kind of nightmare logic where things sort of flow, but it's not in a very possible way. You know, your story, on the other hand, it had named characters. It had such a clear setting. It had a plot. It had, you know, and a twist. And like, you did that in a flash fiction format, essentially. It was so just like elegantly put together. So I wanted to ask, like, what do you like about flash fiction?
I like to write in that very dense kind of poetic way, and it's really difficult to sustain for a novel. So really, the shorter the story, like, I don't write poetry, but I do like writing kind of that style. So yeah, I like flash fiction, and it's quick, and you can get it done, and then get a sense of achievement from having done
Yes.
I have a very poor attention span, I guess.
Oh God, I know.
Is
I do
that
write a
how
lot of.
you feel?
I do write a lot of poetry. I would say I'm like primarily a poet, not a fiction writer. And it's like, I feel like if I, you know, poems, it's like you can sort of have the whole thing sort of memorized and present in your head while you're writing it. And then it frustrates me that I can't do that with a story, like a more traditional sort of 5,000 word story is like, but I don't have it all just memorized, like floating in front of my eyes at once. So I enjoy that flash. You can kind of have it all in your head at once. So